Okay, guys, welcome back. I'm actually not going to do asks in this video. I'm just using this one for reference. And I'm going to try to get the Operation Lead the Walkers Away whole long theory series thing out later this week. Depending on how long it takes me, it might be more like over the weekend or something. I'm not sure, but I'm going to get it out. It's the last thing I do. But for today, I was just going to answer this because it made me smile when it came in. Okay, so now that the season is over, what are you and your friends thinking? What are your thoughts about where it's going and what will happen next? Please tell me you have something. The problem isn't that we don't have anything, it's that we have too many things. So I think the best way to answer this, rather than listening to me ramble on and on and on, so it'll be a little bit more structured, is just to read to you some of the conversations that we've been having. Most of them took place right after the finale, so over the last week or slightly more. So let's just go to that. And I will say that a lot of this is Galadrieljones giving me her theories, and she may actually do much more of a deep dive, like her own post on this later. So let's start with her initial take on the ending. She says the use of the Spanish version of Hurt at the end of the Nine Inch Nails song, mostly associated with Johnny Cash, was very unexpected to me. Seasons 1 through 2 ended pensively, but on an upswing for Daryl. At the end of season 1, Daryl makes a choice to stay. It's his choice, and that's progress. At the end of season 2, he and Carol survived the tunnel and are getting ready to go home. They survived a major ordeal and are now looking to the future. But this ending is a sad ending. It feels like a setback. All of these people were ready to move forward with their lives, but now they have to keep fighting. It comes right after Daryl realizes he's always running like he's on a merry-go-round. It makes it feel like he doesn't have a choice. When he hugs Carol, he looks totally pained. It's like he's just had this huge realization about himself, but he hasn't made a choice. Daryl is truly in the belly of the whale. And then Fede shows up, which is totally out of the blue, but also it's believable. His mother lets him out because people never change. Then the boat burns. Again, it feels like a Deus Ex Machina because nothing ever changes. It feels like the merry-go-round of Daryl's life playing out before his eyes. Like when Beth dies, and then Denise dies, and then Connie disappears, and then he has to kill Leah, and then Isabel dies. Nothing ever changes. And yet, Daryl frequently affects change wherever he goes. He is a catalyst. It's because of Daryl that Fede's lies were exposed, that El Alcazar has been destabilized, the people of Solaz are free, and Justina and Roberto are together. In some ways, it's the burning of the boat. The burning of the boat is actually a fresh start. It feels like fate. Like, is he supposed to be there for some reason? But that's but the use of that song, the final POV from Daryl, feels like we're embedded in Daryl's psychology. To him, it's just the same as it always was. It's sad. I think Daryl has made huge strides in coming to these realizations about himself, but I think we're learning that he was much deeper in denial than we realized. He might not even realize when he's talking about Beth. He might have shielded her so deep in his subconscious that it's still inaccessible. He is working his way through Merle and the root cause of the tension that Beth herself helped address and still. But that was before he'd lost her. He still had some hope inside him, which she found and yanked to the surface. But now it's like he's really, really, really low. He's still wondering, he is still wandering the Acheron, a soul without a home. We're still in Daryl's psychology, and we haven't really breached the surface of the real world yet. Um, the ending too, with the miraculous fire that just like burns out of nowhere and sabotages their way home, it feels like the hand of God, like the Bob thing. It went like that because it had to, because it was always going to. And with Codron lurking in the background, we know he's going to effect some sort of change for them. Anyway, I'm not disappointed that we didn't see Beth because it's clear to me that where whatever they're doing with Daryl, it's bigger than I realize. He's only just cracked the surface on his own childhood trauma. Acknowledging that he's never been able to settle down in one place can only lead to the one time he was ready to settle down in one place with Beth. At the same time, I have no clue what the twist ending was supposed to be. Codron the Fire Fade feels like some sort of talking point made up by reviewers to draw pits. Okay, so I wanted to read this not only because it's very, very insightful, but because me and Galadriel have a back and forth about Daryl's psychology as we move forward. But I just wanted to say to, respond to parts of it. Um, the psychology thing is important, and I'll get more into that in a minute. But also, people were so. I do think it was the boat catching fire that the reviewer was talking about when she said something's going to make you roll your eyes and feel like same old, same old. But that's because people are just watching it on the surface. And honestly, in order to really get what's going on, you have to watch it with more depth than that. So I think Galadrieljones makes an excellent point about the fact that this feels very much like fate, like he was not meant to leave Spain yet. And then we have Codron in the background. So clearly that's true. They're going somewhere with that. Okay. So that's why I never am, quite as frustrated or vitriolic with the narrative because I can see where it's going. And yeah, it is a slow burn at times. It is. And I understand why people are frustrated with that. But if you're going to watch the show, you got to know that it's going to be a slow burn and that they are going somewhere with it. Okay. Let's see. I think the rest of it is mostly the psychology. Oh yeah, but it's a lot deeper than we thought. And I'm gonna get a little bit into the missing 17 days and how that might uh, interact with that. Okay, so but you know, she also said a lot of the same things I did in my video, that Beth was the one time that he didn't run, that he actually wanted to settle down. And this goes back to her because she specifically talked to him about Merle, and she understood a lot of where his trauma came from just by watching him. And nobody else, even Carol, we have not seen her have that kind of insight. Him and Carol are very similar because they both come from traumatic, abusive backgrounds, but we've never seen Carol like look at him and dig underneath the skin like that, like Beth did. And he wasn't even particularly close with Beth before Still and Alone. You know, it wasn't like they hung out together talking like he did with Carol. And I think that that's an interesting point because um, you know, first of all, your romantic partner should challenge you to a certain extent, and Beth definitely did that. But part of the reason that Daryl and Carol cling, you know, from the very beginning, from like season two, clung on to each other was because they, you know, obviously they had that in common, but at the same time, they were safe together because they had that in common. But it was never necessarily about healing one another. And that's different from what his dynamic with Beth was. Okay, so let's just keep going a little bit. So then Galadriel says this is an answer to something we asked her. You know, let's try that again. Then Galadriel says here, yes, I'm definitely hopeful for next season. I was just struck by how deeply the season seemed to be about Daryl's psychology and how that ending reflected it. And in some ways, it's like seeing the boat burn. It's so much like the Moonshine Shack, but it's got some other meaning. It's like it's burning down the past, but it's also cauterizing something, sealing off this diseased notion of home so that he can keep going. The burning boat felt like a strong indicator that his destiny is somewhere in Europe. You're also right that they had to deal with Carol too by squaring away Carol and Antonio. They are setting up Daryl for his own mission. The Codron angle is so intriguing, and I had the exact same thought as you per the PPP Association. It was much more clearly centered this time too. And remember the rule: to make it matter, tap it twice. They've now shown the jacket twice. It is real. It's happening. It's just poor Daryl. He needs to get his heart healed. So yeah, that was one other thing that I wanted to touch on too, is how much the boat was like the burning the moonshine shack down. And especially if you think about his talk with Carol, he actually said he was afraid to go home. Not afraid to go home in general or because of the people or anything, but because he was afraid that once he gets there, he's going to fall back into his own patterns from before. So it's interesting that then he didn't get to go home once he recognized that. So it does feel like the burning of the Moonshine Shack, in that we know that, you know, the point of burning the Moonshine Shack was to burn down the old destructive patterns and make way for new, much more healthy patterns. And it almost feels like that's what's going on here. He needs to figure this out. I mean, he has recognized it, but he hasn't healed it all the way. And that's why he's afraid to go home. So it's almost like until he can heal it, he's not going home, right? And how's he going to heal it? He's got to go find Beth, right? Okay. Some of this is a little bit, I don't know, less relevant, but I don't know if you remember in my video, I said, I swear we've heard hollow men before, and I couldn't remember where. Actually, I think it was WDU pointed out that this was just the name that somebody had for walkers. They called them hollows. And so I think that's probably what I was thinking of, and that was pretty recent that we heard that. So then Galadrieljones says here, I feel even more strongly now that this season was basically made as a kind of narrative emulation of his sadness. In that sense, I think it was really beautifully done and definitely my favorite of the three so far. That's interesting. I mean, obviously, it's like, are we talking about people who are hollow because of their sadness? Like, I really like that insight. The other thing about it is that Fede called them hollow men, or no, he called them dogs. And then Sergio said, "Oh, the hollow men?" He said, "Yeah, the dogs." And so, without any other explanation of that, and just knowing that they usually call them hollow men, why did Fede call them dogs? There was no reason for that. You guys, it was completely superfluous, which means that that is a serious reference that the writers put in. Okay, there's no other reason for it there except to call them dogs and to make a dog reference. Okay, so just want to throw that out there and keep in mind that this happened in the finale, it wasn't directly before the boat because a lot happened between that and they had to go through the whole thing where they exposed Fede and Justina came back. And there was a lot that happened. But by the end of the episode, the same episode, they were burning the boat. And if the boat is like the Moonshine Shack, then we have a dog reference. In Still, we had um, well, I guess it was in Alone. We had the three-eyed dog. But the point is, it's a serious reference and then the burning, right? So it's all connected. And again, I feel like this is the kind of thing we often say is for TD because who else is going to recognize that? Nobody is. Everyone's going to be like, oh, that's weird. He called them dogs. Okay. And then they're going to move on and they're never even going to remember that. Like we are the only ones that would pick up on a serious reference. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So then WD says, something else I meant to mention on your analysis is about Merle. You had said you didn't know why Merle had left Daryl with their father and mentioned the scene from 310 home. Daryl and Merle were in the woods fighting and Daryl's back is exposed to Merle. If Merle didn't say this outright, he implied it, but I'm pretty sure he told Daryl Merle had to leave because if he stayed, he was going to kill their father, which makes me wonder if this was the catalyst scene in the flashbacks when Merle leaves Daryl behind. It would mean that Merle was old enough to join the army, which would make even a bigger age gap, I think at least 12 years instead of 10 years between him and Daryl. Anyway, I'm wondering if that scene where Merle is telling Daryl to run, maybe the father was beating Merle and Daryl was trying to get in between them and got punched or whatever to cause the bloody nose, and Merle was giving him advice about what to do when the father would come after him. He was to run and hide. If Merle truly felt like he could kill the father, it would be an even worse circumstance for Daryl because he would lose what little home he had, plus his father and his older brother. That would have explained a lot, but we won't know until we know for sure. I would love a flashback next season. Daryl remembering Merle and then remembers the scene with Beth when she, without judgment, says, "You miss your brother, I miss Maggie." Galadriel says, so sad, but yes, I could definitely see Daryl trying to protect Merle, even though he's just a little boy. Merle would have been pissed at Daryl for always taking unnecessary risks and sent him to run. I also liked your thought that this could be leading to the story he tells Andrea and bloodletting. To be honest, that was my initial speculation because he does seem to be running into the woods and because it would lead in nicely with the "I belong with you, find me" note. I was thinking of how nicely that would round out into him being found by the right person because remember, Leah does find him later, but she is clearly a bizarro Beth. Okay, and then I'm not going to go through all of it, but Galadrieljones does have a lot about Codron that she's looking at. This part's interesting. Okay, guys, I also think that Codron's tattoo, which is the symbol of pouvoir, as a sort of dramatic, violent take on the fleur de lis, resembles the fleur de lis sculpture at the funeral home in Alone. I super duper think that Codron is going to get us to Beth somehow. So we've been saying that for a minute because he's the serious character that we think he'll lead to Beth in some way, but that's interesting that his tattoo is almost reminiscent of the fleur de lis, which we saw around Beth and Daryl. So I really liked that. The fleur de lis is also an important symbol in the Da Vinci Code. It is a real-life symbol for the French monarchy, probably why Janae inverts it and uses it to symbolize her own revolutionary faction. It is one of the many clues that Langdon follows on his journey to find out that the Holy Grail is actually a person. The pouvoir symbol is essentially an upside-down fleur-de-lis, which looks like a torch. I do not think it's a coincidence that there is a fleur-de-lis inside the funeral home where Daryl and Beth are, and that the fleur-de-lis is such a prominent symbol in France, which is being used by the faction who ousted the wildfire scientists from the country, or that the fleur-de-lis is tattooed so prominently on Codron's face. Another sort of weird thing with Codron is when he first shows up, they immediately show him walking by the laboratory where there is our doctor doing experiments. This is in season 1 of Daryl Dixon. He stops and kind of looks at it for a moment and then he moves on to Janae's office. Later, after Janae hires him, she takes him back to the lab where there is like this beeping going on in the background. It sounds like a heart monitor. Codron stops and watches the scientists inject a walker with serum, and then 18 seconds later, the walker, after attacking the glass, crashes out and dies. Its head seems to explode with blood coming from the ears, eyes, etc. So not only are they sort of setting Codron up with this non-specific cover story, they're also setting him up in juxtaposition to the wildfire experiments. I do think there's some relationship between what the doctor is doing in France and what happened in Georgia, re the prison flu. Like, I think it has something to do with the byproduct of manipulating the wildfire gene to exchange its particular expression. The bleeding from the eyes and exploding head thing is too specific for everything not to be related, but I honestly still don't have any good speculation for what it could be, whether it's actually a flu or some sort of toxin. The fact that Celia poisons people with it in Mexico, that's from Fear the Walking Dead, suggests it could be a toxin. However, Celia is in is the housekeeper and nanny for Thomas Abigail, a pharmaceutical magnate. So, like, the possibility that there is a pathogen exists. Too many unknowns. So, yeah, but I am now obsessed with Codron being very set up as a spy and also associated with both PPP and wildfire experiments. Very interesting things to come. So, this may be a little over some people's heads, but just know that we, and especially Galadrieljones is really good at keeping track of this. We watch everything in the TWD universe, so we are pulling in clues from, the world beyond and Fear the Walking Dead, and even Tales of the Walking Dead had a lot of interesting clues in it. The PPP stuff was really heavy in the Devon story. And we also liked, I don't remember what the name of it was, but the one where they talked about morphic resonance that had Parker Posey in it. That episode was super interesting. And so it's not necessarily Beth and Daryl related, and it's not necessarily the characters that we all love, even outside of Beth and Daryl, but they give us hints to where they are going in the overall universe. So if this seems a little bit over your head, just know that she's not making this up. We're pulling from the different spin-offs and the different series within the TWD universe and trying to put it all together for where we think they're going. And I do 100% think that Beth and Daryl, along with Rick and Michonne and Maggie and Negan, that all of the main characters who are still alive are going to be right at the center of it. And so this is where we're getting the wildfire experiments. And Gimple started planting seeds for this when he took over at the beginning of season 4 with the eye bleeding disease that then they got at the prison, and then, bringing Beth front and center. Like, all of this, they had to wait until they had gotten through the comic book material in the main show before they could really pursue any of this, but they did plant a lot of hints for it along the way. And now we're seeing them finally build the actual story that they're going for. All right, so, and then Galadriel says, also, I agree the dog's reference wouldn't have tripped me up except for it trips up Sergio. Like, why would they create that moment unless they wanted us to pay attention? Either just an overt dog reference or perhaps a reference to the mad dogs in them. I'm not sure. I don't remember any instances of guard dogs specifically in TWD, only feral dogs. So just more on that dog's reference. Okay, this is where we get into more of the psychology. So she says, I've been waiting for a reason to dig out my old Prophet Morgan theory, and it finally came. Okay, you guys, I got to tell you that I have been friends with Galadrieljones for years at this point, and she has always talked about Morgan as a prophet. It's been kind of a pet interest for her. So now we're getting a lot of confirmation that that's true because of the parallels with Codron, but this is exactly the kind of thing that I love, because even though this wasn't really the thing that I had the most interest in, she did, and she's constantly talking about it. Like, every, even if it's just a few times a year, she'll see a symbol and be like, oh, there's more of the Morgan prophet symbol. And then this is why TD is right, because we pick these things up and sometimes we don't have any way to confirm them right away. We just go, no, something about that, that's interesting. They're putting that in on purpose. I don't know what it means. And then we'll get a parallel down the road and we'll be like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. And it confirms what we were looking at before. And this is a really good example of this, okay? So she has known that Morgan was a prophet for a long time. And now we're seeing parallels with Codron. All right, so I'm starting to feel like a lot of, she's going to say that here, what I just explained, old TD theories and symbolism that once made so little sense, but despite us knowing they're important, are suddenly going to come into context and take on a whole new layer of meaning, like puzzle pieces finally taking their place. The whole pilgrimage thing in season 5A, for so long, I felt hung up on the coda signs in the trees, right? And that's when Morgan, in the episode Coda, finds the church, and there's those, they're either X's or crosses with a circle around them. Turns out the signs are probably incidental. What matters is that they are markers on a pilgrimage, and the altar too. So much of it actually makes sense now. Okay, also, I remember the railroad spikes in Find Me. So I don't know if you remembered this. We were really obsessed with Find Me. Daryl kept tapping his fingers together, and there were these clusters of 3 railroad spikes that he kept looking at, and the camera would focus on them. And they obviously mean something. They're marking something, but we didn't know what they were, right? So the tapping, Daryl's mystery scar, that's where he got the scar over his eye. He just suddenly had it, but the first time we saw it was in Find Me. And the mystery girl who later looks just like Beth. I think probably we haven't even begun to tap into that yet. Norman says season 4 is super weird. Well, Find Me was also super weird. Would be awesome to get some clarity on anything that happened in that symbolic soup. And then I said, it would definitely be great to go back and rewatch lots of stuff between now and next season. Okay, this is just me talking about what I want to do. About Find Me, I can't help but wonder if it all boils down to the same thing. We don't know what the tapping and the spikes mean, but maybe even though they're different symbols, they actually they're actually still pointing to the green route or pilgrimage route. Like romantically, Leah was a stop on Daryl's pilgrimage toward finding his soulmate. And that was just a thought I had while reading that. And then Galadriel answers and she says, yes, I did consider that the railroad spikes would be kind of deranged pilgrimage in the underworld. I do think that's related, but I think there's more to it. As related to Daryl's trauma, because the whole thing is like couched in psychosis. It feels like it could just be pure metaphor. I still can't get over his fearful reaction when he sees the spikes, and how they seem to set into motion a sequence of events involving Dog, but only after he experiences the psychotic break during the storm. It just all feels so off. The tapping is separate, a coping mechanism for trauma survivors, which he uses when he's been taken prisoner by the Reapers, aka Leah, who, when seen from a distance or through a burlap sack on his head, looks exactly like Beth. Whatever it is, it all seems related specifically to Leah, and it has something to do with his very specific trauma revolving around Beth. Not Merle, not Rick, it's Beth. We haven't gotten there yet, I don't think. Daryl hasn't really yet hit this sort of rock bottom since he got to Europe. He's been pretty in control, but if he thinks he sees Beth or if he gets some sort of whiff of Beth, I could see him losing his mind. So this is like an interesting point because even though we talk about all the people that Daryl has trauma around, and remember that line that they said was leaked from the season 2 finale that didn't end up making it in, where he mentioned it was like him talking to Isabel, and he said, if you see Merle or Beth or Glenn, tell them I'm sorry and that I'm still trying, basically. So it's like, okay, well, that's admitting he has trauma around the deaths of those people. Interesting that Rick wasn't involved, that he didn't mention Rick, but they have said now that because he never found Rick's body, that he still thinks there's a possibility Rick's out there somewhere. And that, okay, I'm not gonna go on a tangent of that right now, but that leads back to the search and why we'll get into it here in a minute. But anyway, the point here that I'm trying to make is that we, despite Merle, despite Glenn, we don't see episodes where Daryl sees another character that looks like one of them and that he has all this drama around, right? We only saw someone who looked like Beth, which was Leah. So really interesting point there. So it could honestly just be foreshadowing for the hell he has to go through to acknowledge that Beth could quite possibly be alive. Depending on what happened, he might blame himself, read the argument with Carol in Find Me, and how he's always trying to play the survivor, that he blames himself for losing Leah when we learn later that it had nothing to do with him. It could really dismantle his entire identity to learn that Beth is or simply could be alive. Kind of terrifying if you think about it. Daryl is already prone to episodes of psychosis, and we've known this since season 2. Breaking down the walls that are guarding his tragic childhood could weaken the stability of his entire mental state, just making him more prone to breaking down. I'm thinking about how Norman has referred to season 4 now as emotionally heavy and weird, and he's talked about how some of the filming has been really difficult and emotional. Just thinking out loud, as I think the worst is probably yet to come for poor Daryl. And so this is what that made me think of when I was reading that. And I said, yeah, I mean, we could really go into the weeds with this. I talked before about how maybe he sees it as that he left Beth behind or gave up on her. And really, since they thought she was a walker anyway, it's not like she would have lived either way, at least not in his mind, right? But I feel like this whole I always feel the need to run thing is tied to stuff that happened during the missing 17 days. Maybe he actually saw something that should have made him realize she could be alive. But between all the trauma that happened at Grady, his more logical, conscious beliefs about her being dead, and this trauma response of running, he just couldn't process it. And when he breaks down his walls, as you put it, he'll finally hit on it. While reading what you wrote above, I also thought of what they did when they introduced Alpha. They made it seem like Lydia's father was the abusive one when the opposite was actually true. But what they showed us in Lydia's flashbacks and what she was trying to convince Daryl of was actually untrue. So as we've said for a long time, they might return not only to season 5 to show us things that were untrue, but maybe to Find Me to show us that Daryl is just remembering things wrong. And we've talked about that lots of times. It will be very interesting to see where they go with it. And Galadriel says, yes, this is good. I mean, it's sad, lol, but it's interesting. The notion that he ran because he couldn't take it, couldn't process what happened. The idea of finding her as a walker was too much for him. His mind was breaking down, so he fell back on old habits and just gave up. And he let Rick convince him to move on from the search or something along those lines. It lines up with his instinct to just join the claimers rather than continue tracking Beth right after her disappearance. He made tracking Rick into an entire hermit job for 5 years after Rick disappeared, almost like he was making up for something. He couldn't give up again. And yeah, it would all tie back into the running thing that we've uncovered in season 3. So much to consider. And the other thing that absolutely just floors me about all of this, whether we're right or even a little bit on track with this, is actually the argument, parts of the argument he had with Beth in Alone. He actually talked about his guilt over not continuing to track the governor. He says, if I hadn't given up, if I had just kept going, then he wouldn't have been there to attack the prison, and maybe I could have saved your dad's life. He had so much guilt at that point over Herschel, which of course was not his fault at all. He even told Michonne, there's no trail anymore. If there was any sign of where he'd gone, I'd be there with you. But what's the point if we have no idea where he is or where he went or what direction, So, and there's logic in that. That was true. But he had a lot of guilt over that. So it's interesting if any of this ends up being on track. They actually foreshadowed it. Gimple already knew this when he wrote the argument between Beth and Daryl and Still. Okay, so then Galadriel says, really good point about Lydia. In fact, that could have been a primer for Find Me. Lydia is a traumatized abuse victim, just like Daryl. If Daryl did see something that might have suggested Beth was alive, or at least that she wasn't as dead as they all thought she was, and he ignored it because it was too much or because it just seemed so crazy, and he couldn't risk the realization that he was wrong and she was dead, like having that little bit of hope was more hurtful than even the death itself, then he might have built a whole complex of mental protection around that memory, essentially rewiring his brain to forget or to misremember it as something else. Coming to that realization would be traumatizing in and of itself. So yeah, regardless of what they do, it would be a disservice to Daryl's character not to address what happened with Beth and how the childhood trauma may funnel into his actions after Grady and how that basically wrecked his life. Um, I'll come back to that. And then I said, yeah, definitely. And I can't help but wonder by extension if Sasha played some role in this, the whole Sasha Tyrese theory, that is still a question mark. But once again, until they give us those missing 17 days, it's just impossible to tell for sure. And then I said, oh, and I wanted to say that I think it's mildly hilarious that Norman likes S4 because it's super weird. I laughed when I first saw that because it's just so Norman coded. He always posts weird things on social media and is just drawn to them. But on the flip side, I also think there's always tons of method to his madness. We just don't always know what it is. He's actually very in tune with his character and has even shown through cryptic interviews and answers that he knows way more than we do about what's going on in Daryl's head. So that also makes me super excited for season 4 and what it will bring. All right, you guys. This is a lot that I'm throwing at you. This is very deep in the weeds, but you're asking what we're talking about and what we're thinking. This is it. We're going really deep into the psychology of it. And I also feel like this is another reason that they skipped over those 17 days. I mean, the obvious reason is to not show us what happened because most of the fandom would have picked up that Beth is alive out there somewhere if they had shown us any part of what happened during those missing 17 days. But it's so much deeper than that. It's so much deeper than just they put her in the car because they had to run from a walker horde and they went back and she was gone. Okay, there's a lot more that went down there, and it has affected Daryl deeply ever since. And I don't know even how they're going to go about showing this. It's actually something that's difficult to communicate on the screen. It's much easier to communicate in a written format, like in a book. But, like we said, they did this with Lydia. They showed it to us, and it wasn't terribly clear the way that they showed it on screen, but they had them talk about it afterward, especially in the Talking Dead, show that they always did. So I'm not sure how they're going to go about doing this, but I am very interested to see. And of course, this, as always, this is conjecture, this is a theory, but we're really pulling from what we know, pulling from the weirdness that has never been explained and that continues not to be explained, and that we don't believe that they're going to leave hanging. At some point, they are going to explain it, and it's going to tell us a lot, and we just haven't gotten to it yet. So, as disappointed as we are that we didn't see Beth in season 3, they're leading us towards some sort of, it's either a psychotic break for Daryl, or it's going to be, it might be a break immediately followed by um, some sort of transcendence where he is actually able to face the truth of what really happened and move forward. And, throughout the years, we have talked about how Daryl needs to do certain things in order to, be, I hate to use the phrase be worthy, but it's the one that fits the best, to be worthy of a relationship with Beth. And I don't say that in the sense that he is unworthy. I just mean, there's work he has to do before he can even conceive of the idea that she might be alive. And they certainly reinforced that at the beginning of season 3 of Daryl Dixon because they talked about letting go of your dead. That's one thing he has to do. He has to let go of his dead. But I think he also has to really come to terms with whatever happened back then. And I think he's still running from it. And that's why this theme was so important in season 3. He runs physically from places. He doesn't want to settle down. He doesn't want to stay at home. And it's like, it's a trauma response to be in the drama of running because it's something to do, and he can't stand to sit still because then he has to face himself and all these memories and all this trauma that is unhealed. And that's actually very realistic for a trauma survivor. So he's running. And then we have him in the final episode here recognizing that even though he runs, that's the first step is he recognized this behavior and that it's not healthy. But he also said he was afraid to go home. That means he hasn't healed it yet. So he has to heal this running from the trauma. And in order to do that, he has to come to terms with what happened, and he hasn't done that yet. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. We're just exploring the psychology. So I hope this answers your question. This is where we're at, and we're gonna do more theories and more discussions. The PPP stuff, Codron is really interesting. We're seeing some crossover implications between Daryl Dixon and Dead City, so that's interesting. I want to go back through several symbols that I've kind of mentioned in passing and look at them more deeply, all of that. And maybe it's a good thing that I haven't done my Operation Lead the Walkers Away theory yet, because I actually might have some new insights based on this season of Daryl Dixon. But I will get that out sometime in the next week and a half tops, I promise. But yeah, so whether you think we are totally nuts after seeing what we're talking about, or it's just totally giving you a brain cramp, I mean, you are allowed to think whatever you want. As I said, this is just some of the stuff we're discussing, and this is kind of where we think that it's going. So we could be totally wrong, we could be somewhat right and somewhat wrong. We'll just have to wait and see. So that's what I have for you today. I hope that wasn't too boring or anything. I will be back later with more theories and more asks, as always. So everyone have a fantastic week.